Story 1. The Alone Old Home. Sarah stood at the threshold of the abandoned house, a crumbling Victorian mansion shrouded in overgrown ivy and mystery. She had bought the house impulsively at an auction, drawn to its eerie beauty and the promise of solitude. Locals avoided it, muttering about dark histories, but Sarah, newly single and seeking a fresh start, dismissed their warnings as superstitions. On her first night, the house felt unnervingly quiet. As she unpacked, Sarah heard faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the upstairs bedroom, but each time she checked, the room was empty. It wasn't until midnight that the temperature plummeted. Sarah wrapped herself in blankets, but couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows stretched unnaturally long on the walls, and the floorboards creaked with the weight of unseen footsteps. As she explored the house the next morning, she discovered a hidden door behind a tattered curtain in the hallway. It led to a narrow staircase descending into the basement, a place she hadn't noticed during her initial walkthrough. A sense of dread filled her as she stepped down the creaking stairs. The basement was damp, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and something more foul, like rot. In the corner of the room, Sarah found an old mirror, its surface cracked and grimy. As she wiped away the dust, her reflection revealed something horrifying. A shadowy figure standing behind her, its eyes hollow and face twisted into an inhuman grin. She spun around, but the basement was empty. Heart racing, Sarah glanced back at the mirror, and the figure was gone, replaced by her terrified expression. From that night on, the house grew increasingly hostile. The whispers began, a faint, insidious murmuring that seemed to come from the very walls. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and Sarah's dreams were filled with visions of the shadowy figure dragging her down into darkness. The old house no longer felt like an escape, but a prison. One stormy night, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah fumbled for a flashlight and hurried to the living room, but as the beam flickered, she saw them, the shadows moving independently of the light, creeping closer. She could hear faint, raspy breaths behind her, a sensation of icy fingers brushing her shoulder. The whispers grew louder, repeating a chilling phrase, "You shouldn't have come." Panicked, Sarah ran for the front door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself was refusing to let her leave. She pounded on the windows, screamed for help, but the only response was the mocking laughter of the shadows. Trapped and desperate, Sarah grabbed the mirror from the basement and hurled it against the wall, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. For a brief moment, the whispers stopped, and the shadows retreated. But as Sarah looked at the broken shards on the floor, she realized with horror that each fragment reflected a dozen pairs of eyes staring back at her, watching, waiting. Sarah's nights became sleepless, filled with the constant, unnerving presence of eyes that were never there when she looked. Every mirror, every reflective surface in the house showed glimpses of shadowy figures, watching her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. She tried covering the mirrors, but she could still feel their gaze, relentless and unblinking. One evening, desperate for a reprieve, Sarah decided to leave the house, hoping a walk would clear her mind. But as she reached the front gate, she found it locked, rusted shut, as if it had never been opened. She tugged and yanked, but it refused to budge. It was as though the house didn't want her to leave. Back inside, Sarah started hearing scratching noises coming from the walls, like claws digging through wood. The sounds would start softly, but grew louder and more frantic, as if something was trying to break free. She tried drowning out the noise with music, but the scratching only grew more insistent, echoing in her mind long after it stopped. Sarah decided to confront the basement again, hoping to find some clue about the house's past. She found old newspapers scattered across the floor, yellowed and brittle with age. Headlines screamed of tragedies that had befallen previous occupants, mysterious deaths, disappearances, and fires that had gutted the rooms above. One article mentioned a family that had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only bloodstains and whispers of a curse. As Sarah read, she noticed something strange, a small door embedded in the basement wall. one she hadn't seen before. It was barely large enough for a child to crawl through, and as she approached, the scratching sounds intensified, now accompanied by faint, distant cries. Trembling, she pulled the door open, revealing a narrow crawl space filled with old toys, broken dolls, and faded family photos. In the dim light, she spotted a doll unlike the others, propped up against the wall. It was dressed in an old-fashioned gown, its porcelain face cracked and eyes missing. But it was the note pinned to its chest that made Sarah's blood run cold. She watches. She waits. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The shadows seemed to pulse, moving closer, pressing in on her. She felt a sudden, intense cold wrapping around her ankles, pulling her toward the crawl space. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but the grip tightened. In the dim light, she saw the shadowy figure again, now fully formed, reaching out with skeletal hands. As Sarah fought against the invisible force, she realized the horrifying truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The walls seemed to breathe, the floors groaned as if in pain, and the whispers became screams, deafening and filled with rage. Sarah grabbed her flashlight, frantically shining it in every direction, but the shadows swallowed the light, leaving her in total darkness. Just as Sarah felt herself being dragged completely into the crawl space, she managed to grab onto the doorframe, pulling herself free. She slammed the small door shut, trapping whatever lurked inside. The basement fell silent, but Sarah knew it wasn't over. She could feel the presence behind the walls, waiting for the next moment of weakness. Exhausted and terrified, Sarah stumbled upstairs, vowing to leave the house for good. But as she reached the front door, she found it wide open, as if inviting her to step outside. She hesitated, glancing back into the darkened hallway, where the shadows still loomed, silent and watching. But as Sarah stepped through the door, she heard the faintest whisper, carried on the cold wind. "You'll be back." Sarah fled from the house, gasping for air as she stumbled onto the overgrown front lawn. She didn't stop running until she reached her car parked at the edge of the property. Fumbling with her keys, she finally got the engine started, but when she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw the shadowy figure sitting in the back seat, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. She whipped around, but the seat was empty. Heart pounding, she tore down the road, desperate to put as much distance between herself and the cursed house as possible. For a few days, Sarah stayed with a friend in town, trying to convince herself that everything she had experienced was just a result of stress and fatigue. But the sense of dread never left her. Even in her friend's home, she felt watched. She avoided mirrors, knowing that the shadows could still reach her. Every night, she woke up at exactly 3 a.m., cold sweat clinging to her skin, the feeling of invisible eyes never fading. Desperate for answers, Sarah returned to the library, scouring old records about the house. She discovered that the property had once belonged to a reclusive family known for their bizarre rituals. The youngest daughter, believed to have vanished without a trace, was rumored to have been the center of a dark ceremony gone wrong. According to legend, her spirit was trapped in the house, feeding on the souls of anyone who dared to enter. Sarah knew she had to confront whatever was haunting her, or it would never stop. Armed with salt, candles, and a few hastily gathered tools from online articles about cleansing haunted spaces, she made her way back to the old home. The house loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, as if it had been waiting for her return. As soon as she stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and every breath felt like inhaling ice. Sarah set up the candles in the living room, lighting them one by one. The tiny flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper. She poured salt around herself, forming a protective circle, and began reciting a prayer she barely remembered from her childhood. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices filled with anger and pain. Sarah could feel the house pressing in on her, the walls seeming to bend and twist, almost like they were closing in. The floorboards beneath her feet began to splinter and crack, and the once familiar scratching sound erupted into a furious clawing, as if something was desperately trying to break free. Suddenly, the candles went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Sarah's flashlight flickered on, casting a thin, shaky beam across the room. In the dim light, she saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures emerging from the walls, their forms indistinct but filled with malice. They moved closer, surrounding her salt circle, their whispers now a deafening roar. Sarah raised the flashlight, the beam catching the eyes of the figure that had haunted her since the first night. It stood at the edge of the circle, just beyond the line of salt, staring at her with those empty, hollow eyes. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, the circle of salt was breached. The shadows surged forward, and Sarah felt icy hands gripping her arms, pulling her down. She screamed, struggling against the overwhelming force, but the shadows were too strong. In one last act of defiance, Sarah smashed her flashlight against the floor, the light flickering and sputtering as it broke. The shadows hesitated, recoiling from the sudden burst of light, and in that brief moment, Sarah scrambled free, tearing through the house and out the front door. As she stumbled into the morning light, Sarah knew she couldn't stay. The house had let her go, but only for now. She could still feel the cold grip of the shadows, hear the whispers echoing in her mind. The house wasn't just haunted, it was hungry, and it wouldn't rest until it claimed her soul. Sarah left town that same day, vowing never to return. But no matter how far she ran, she could never escape the feeling that the house was watching, waiting for the moment when she would be drawn back into its dark embrace.